Yes, sorry, you must be getting a bit bored with my face by now. Oh, it's all right, it's gone dark. Thank goodness for that. Let you off the hook. Yes, blunt instruments power. We remember the early Metal Age particularly for its funerary sites, its varied and distinctive pot styles, and of course the metalwork. But another enduring, prolific and highly visual component of the early Metal Age mix is the perforated stone implement. In this lecture I shall attempt to contextualize the use and meaning of the three main categories of such implements. The technology of perforated stone was far from new. It is a feature of later Neolithic mace-heads. But from the beginning of the early Bronze Age, that's period 2, we see the adoption and widespread acceptance of a foreign-inspired style known as the battle axe. This quickly led to insular styles of battle axe, but also to a more massive variant which is distinct in key ways and requires its own label, the axe hammer. A further class also emerged, the centrally perforated mace-head, although this remained relatively subordinate numerically. The qualification centrally perforated is crucial, for these mace-heads were not derived from the intrusive design, but instead were a modification of insular late Neolithic mace-heads which had offset perforations. Finds of the two more common classes are extremely numerous in Britain. At the last count, and this was quite a while back, 550 battle axes, 950 axe hammers. There are far fewer centrally perforated mace-heads. They have not been listed or quantified as such, and there is the potential complication of a gradation into some other poorly dated types of perforated implement. There is some variation in the level of finish of these objects. It's well known that the battle axes and mace-heads tend to be finely shaped and highly polished, whereas axe hammers generally have a slightly coarser surface finish. Nevertheless, all three categories required a considerable investment of time in their manufacture, plus some skill, especially the ability to drill cylindrical or slightly wasted perforations. You can see also that they can be made from attractively marked or coloured rocks. In many ways, these perforated stone implements create their own subspheres of context and meaning in the early Bronze Age. A similar case was already been presented for halberds in Lecture 2. However, only axe hammers closely follow the halberd pattern of not occurring in burial contexts. One or two examples may have been with burial deposits, and a few others are from burial mounds. But remember, this is out of nearly 1,000 examples. On the other hand, battle axes and mace-heads are more regular inclusions in the grave, in the order of 20% of the two types. Much analysis has been devoted in the past as to whether battle axes and axe hammers are just different halves of a continuous spectrum. I don't want to get bogged down in the typological detail here. It has been well covered in the past by Fiona Rowe and later Malcolm Fenton. Suffice it to say that there are very good grounds for seeing them as conceptually distinct because of differences in dimensions, proportions, finish, and contexts of deposition. In essence, the difference between battle axes and axe hammers was one of bulk, not style. Both have the axe-like end. And conversely, the difference between battle axes and mace-heads was one of style, not bulk. Inspection of any battle axe would quickly tell you, however, that their axe-like end was no cutting edge. Despite appearances, this too is really a percussive or bludgeoning instrument, thus functionally no different from a mace-head. It just happens to be a mace-head masquerading as an axe. Some 118 battle axes are known or suspected to be from burial contexts spanning periods 2 to 4. It's a surprising number, isn't it? These associations give us vital insights as to how they were regarded. As we saw earlier, at the stage when battle axes were introduced, it is the dagger that can be identified as the signifier of certain men of seniority. We can probably assume that battle axes too were normally male accoutrements. There are not many reliable sexings of accompanying burials, but only one so far has been identified as a possible female. That's the one from Stanton Moor, T36 in Derbyshire. If battle axes were first adopted as by high-status males to give added weight to their persona, we might expect them to appear alongside other high-status trappings, especially daggers. And indeed, it transpires that there are several burials, 9 at most, with both early-style battle axes designated here as Group 1 and flat bronze daggers. The slide also features the familiar grave group from East Kennet, not far from Avebury. Perhaps less well appreciated is the point that these contexts are outnumbered almost 3 to 1 by those which lacked a dagger. We're looking at the bar for period 2, the lowest bar, and we're comparing the orangey colours in relation to the lilacs. Incidentally, when in my diagrams you see the percentage given as a range like this, that is merely to express the difference between including uncertain burial contexts and excluding them. Moreover, by period 3, next bar up, which represents the high point of battle axe burials, virtually none had daggers alongside, just 1 in Britain and 1 in Ireland. At this stage, as many as 52 were deposited without a dagger. Now you can see in the top bar that there was a sudden reversal of this and a small late group of burials, and we'll come on to those later. It is probably significant that among the typologically more evolved battle axes of period 2, those I've designated Group 2 here in the slide, only 1 is associated with a dagger. So it's possible to suggest that the battle axe dagger combination was preferentially early within that period. So if at first battle axes were drawn into the insular repertoire to serve a supporting role, it is clear that this role did not last. Very quickly the type was seen to be capable of proclaiming a given identity in its own right. The type may not have signified exactly the same as the metal dagger, but I do think it probable that the battle axe, like the flint dagger discussed in the last lecture, was being used contrapuntally in order to distinguish an identity in death. I'll leave aside for now the question of whether this can be extrapolated back to contrasting identities in life. Just as for contemporary bronze daggers, dagger graves, pots are not commonly associated with early battle axes. Long-necked beakers occur just 3 or 4 times. We saw one at East Kennet in an earlier slide, and there's another here from Garton Slack. And there's already a shift in pottery types associated with the Group 2 battle axes in the later half of period 2. Two collared urns and 1 or perhaps 2 food vessels. But generally the burial rite involving battle axes did not at this stage require a pot. In fact, associations of any other kind are not numerous, Garton Slack 37 here being an unusually well-furnished grave, and indeed the only secure association between a battle axe and a flint dagger. More normally, the battle axe itself was sufficient to serve whatever purpose was intended by the grave goods, as we saw was the case for May daggers in dagger graves. There are all sorts of problems with the aging of the associated skeletons, and only the crudest of comparisons is likely to have any validity. Even the distinction between those younger than about 25 years and those older may be a bit fuzzy, because sometimes the assessment simply says adult. As far as we can tell, there is no significant difference between the age profiles for period 2 battle axe graves and contemporary dagger graves. One sign of modification in associated funeral rites, however, may be picked up from the sidedness of inhumation burials of this period. The majority were still buried on their left sides, the legacy of the original beaker rite for high-profile men. However, a third of the individuals, accompanied by battle axes, were turned onto their right side, a much higher proportion than for contemporary dagger-only accompanied corpses, with figures of just 3 to 7%. You can see that depending on which you include, the graves with battle axes present are 25 or up to 50% of the total on their right side. I've already noted that after period 2, the funerary use of battle axes increases. Up to 54 burials are documented for period 3 and the earlier part of period 4, roughly spanning 1950 to 1650 Cal BC. This is certainly the high point of the battle axe, at least in terms of its funerary application. The extant agings of the buried individuals suggest a shift towards a slightly younger age profile, although I would want to see re-evaluation of the relevant remains before hanging too much on this shift. If we turn to distribution, there is an incredibly important relationship to dagger burials, which were at an all-time low during period 3. There are just limited enclaves featuring both dagger graves and battle axe graves: Wessex, the Fen region, the Yorkshire Wolds, the Murray Coast, and Ulster into Connaught. These surround a large swathe of Middle Britain, possibly extending across to Eastern Ireland, which has yielded only battle axes in funerary contexts. This could be used to support the argument that at a general level, the battle axe in the grave was now doing the job of the dagger. Fiona Rowe's earlier analysis of battle axe morphology made it clear that with time, different variants came to be developed not in a strict succession, but along parallel lines. Some were regionally specialised forms, but not all. With better dating now, we can endorse this diversification process during period 3. Using just the associated finds, I would identify 5 modal groups for this period, groups 3 to 7. As well as the morphological distinctions, different emphases can be seen in their respective associations and distributions. These groups account for most of Rowe's intermediate and late series, and seem to have been largely or partially coeval. Diversity here can be argued to reinforce the social importance of battle axes during these 3 centuries. There was evidently a degree of competition between differently styled implements. I don't envisage this in terms of modern trade competition, more in terms of personal or group affiliations to particular styles, sources, or exchange networks. One feature of this set of burials is an increase in the incidence of associated pottery. Overall, for period 3 and early period 4, around 57% of burials include a vessel. This is up from between 29 and 35% in period 2. In fact, if we break down the period 3 totals into constituent battle axe groups, we see pronounced variations ranging from the low 30s to almost 90%. And it's perhaps significant that it is the 3 typologically more developed of these groups, 5, 6 and 7, that have above average frequencies of pottery. Now, if this is not a chronological trend, and at present the radiocarbon evidence does not obviously support that, then it would suggest instead that the fancier styles of battle axe were preferentially put in graves with vessels. The period 3 early 4 pottery associations are virtually all of urns, usually of course containing a cremation, by now the dominant burial rite. Just 2 had a food vessel. 4 of the urn burials also had ceramic cups, and in 2 or 3 further burials the cup was the only vessel. When the type is known, the great majority of urns are collared urns, 14 examples. 5 are cordoned urns, with just 1 vase urn. This is not too surprising in the context of the collared urn being the prevalent burial urn of the early half of the 2nd millennium across Britain. Nevertheless, we have a high-profile male burial mode which makes recurrent use of battle axes in combination with collared or cordoned urns. Now, given how common pots are in graves generally, their inclusion might seem to be of little consequence. But it strikes me as important that starting from the period 2 baseline, when dagger graves and battle axe graves alike seem to shun ceramic associations, we see a renewed appreciation of the importance of placing a pot with such burials. My feature burial for this trend is a recently excavated cremation burial from Stanbury in West Yorkshire. This produced an unusually diverse grave group: the battle axe, a bone belt hook, 2 bronze ornaments thought to be earrings, a bone pin with swollen head, an incense cup, and collared urns. Yes, I did say urns in plural. 3 accompanied the burial, which is quite unusual. Before we leave battle axe burials, it is instructive to consider the tail end of the whole series, my group 8. At this time of declining funerary use, we nevertheless have some of the most elegantly shaped of battle axes. There seem to be some important reversals of previous association trends. Firstly, although the group 8 contexts are few, there is a strong association with bronze daggers, not even matched at the beginning of the sequence. Secondly, the burial rite represented seems to have attached less importance again to including urns. Only 2 burials had them, while a third, the famous one from Hove in Sussex, had instead an amber cup. This is just one among other relatively exotic associations. Aside from the Cowart and Snow's Hill daggers, in 4 graves there is the addition of a rather complex spearhead at Snow's Hill, which you can see more or less in the middle of the slide. There are bronze pins both there and at Loose Howe, and a neat perforated whetstone at Hove with the amber cup. These grave assemblages do not all slavishly follow a blueprint, but they do suggest a particular funerary expression that had veered significantly away from preceding burial customs involving battle axes. Moreover, it differs significantly from the contemporary grave inventory of Wessex, where there is only one very tentative battle axe burial at this stage. It is reputed to be from a barrow near Stonehenge, but nothing is known of the circumstances. Although Wessex has an apparent concentration of dagger graves at this stage, undoubtedly enhanced by preferential excavation, the familiar recurring additions there are bone tweezers, neatly shaped perforated whetstones, and pins, both bronze and bone. The broader zone outside Wessex not only has the fine battle axes in graves and the exotic goods just mentioned, but also further examples of exotics down in the southwest peninsula. For example, the gold-studded amber pommel from Hamilton Down, Devon, and the Rillerton gold cup from Cornwall. So the graves in Wessex at this time are not very lavishly furnished. I've already made the point that in terms of function, technology and finish, battle axes and mace-heads are essentially the same object type. That it was considered necessary to develop the mace-head from its Neolithic antecedents rather than create further battle-axe variants, may suggest a concern to create a sceptre with a distinctive look that also had the benefit of a distinct ancestry. It may also be significant that current dating evidence suggests it was around the beginning of period 3 that we see both the resurrection and adaptation of the mace-head form and the first significant diversification in battle-axe forms, my ellipse within an ellipse. Both processes may be seen as responses to common social pressures or desires for variation. Not many were placed in burials, a maximum of 17, of which 2 are Irish finds, and only 9 are from secure associations. The sex of individuals buried with mace-heads is very poorly documented, as some are early finds and others unsexed cremations. The modern excavated inhumation from Ingleby Barwick in Cleveland is of an adult male, and this was the antiquarian judgment too for those at Bush Barrow and Cleethorpes 139. So the slender indications are that mace-heads, like battle-axes and daggers, were seen as male gear. Yet among this small number there is a hint of a contextual differentiation from contemporary battle-axes. 3 mace-heads occur in association with daggers, all dating to period 3. 2 are definite burials at Bush Barrow and Cleethorpes 139, and the third is the more enigmatic group from Clandon Barrow that we saw in yesterday's lecture. On the other hand, the 2 burials most firmly dated to period 4 by radiocarbon from Clough Head in Kincardineshire and Ingleby Barwick in Cleveland have only the mace-head. Although still a minority, and the percentage cannot be accurately calculated, the dagger associations represent a higher proportion, you can see here 20 to 33%, than the minuscule 4% seen for contemporary battle-axes associated with daggers. Is it possible that the very independence established for the funerary usage of battle-axes led to this situation? It had become taboo to place battle-axe and dagger in the same grave. Perhaps by introducing a brand new type of fine stone-headed sceptre, it became admissible to enhance certain special dagger graves. We only have to look at the conjectural reconstruction of the mace group of artefacts in the Bush Barrow grave to appreciate the potential impact such an object could make. The mace battle-axe distinction is in effect the early Metal Ages equivalent of playing with words, but we should not underestimate the potential of morphological nuance to present distinct meanings. The suggestion that mace-heads were set up in opposition to battle-axes might imply that they were part of a concerted, coherent front. If this was the case conceptually, however, it did not translate into style. Not only are their forms varied, but so too were materials, with examples in bone, antler, and famously at Clandon in jet with gold-capped shale insects. Interestingly, at least 2 stone mace heads appear to be reworkings of battle-axes. Pellint in Cornwall and Garth Bibio in Montgomeryshire. The outline drawing of Pellint shows its reconstruction as originally a Group 1 battle-axe. Sir John Evans suspected this way back in his Ancient Stone Implements, and my study of it confirms his assessment. Even the more conventional stone examples split into a variety of forms, if we look at all mace heads, including those without context. Some of these may be relatively exceptional morphologies, and again there's the question of some potentially merging into pebble hammers. Nevertheless, it is clear there was diversity. This does not appear to have been a materially or stylistically unified expression, even if it was a movement with a common goal. Axe hammers are perhaps the most difficult to interpret of the major perforated stone categories. Yet they represent a phenomenal investment of labour and saw prodigious output, as I've already said. These are blunt instruments of power par excellence. No one has yet dared to suggest a temporal sequence because of the virtual absence of dating evidence, but they almost certainly span much of the early Bronze Age. Their form suggests origins contemporary with the earliest battle axes, while the radiocarbon dated example from Cleethorpes, Humberside, which we'll see shortly, indicates continued use down to period 4. One important correlation found by Fiona Rowe is that axe hammers with slightly convex profiles, which are by far the majority overall, are preferentially made of rock groups 15 and 18, originating in northern England, as well as the comparable petrographies in Scotland. In contrast, the minority concave-faced implements were most frequently made of groups 12 and 14, their sources lying further south in the Welsh Marches and English Midlands, respectively. This immediately suggests gross regional preferences, and this is emphasised more graphically by the embellished fluted variant, whose distribution is almost exclusively in Dumfriesshire and Kirkcudbrightshire. Fluting is therefore a feature that is restricted even within the main concentrations of these implements. Today I want to focus on two aspects of these impressive objects, their function and their relative distribution, and then go on to make the case that their lack of formal archaeological context itself constitutes a context that is interpretable. There is just one axe hammer seemingly from a burial context, the one top right. It was found in 1899 when groundworks for building dug into a small cairn at Low House Farm, Lancashire. In the centre was, I quote, a walled-up box-like space, presumably a kist. The farmer unearthed an urn containing calcined bones, and the axe hammer was in the proximity of the urn. Another from Cononley in West Yorkshire is said to have been found with a dug-out canoe, perhaps a tree-trunk coffin, but the circumstances surrounding it are very poorly documented. And there are maybe 3 more vaguely reported to be from burial mounds, as distinct from burials. 2 examples are shown here. Interestingly, some of these finds are at the small end of the size spectrum for axe hammers. And keep in mind, this paltry number relates to almost 1,000 recorded specimens. In this era of pervading funerary rites, avoidance of or exclusion from funerary contexts seems quite extraordinary. Many commentators have considered the function of these heavy objects, which can weigh anything up to 4.5 kilos. No single functional interpretation, though, is very convincing. One example was found with its shaft intact, that from Cleethorpes, Humberside, which confirms the predicted hafting arrangement and has the further value of giving its shaft length. A hafted axe hammer had very much the look of the modern woodman's axe, with the obvious caveat that the obtuse unsharpened edge precludes effective chopping. And even log splitting has been effectively argued against by Kevin Leahy. They could, of course, have served as general-purpose hammers or crushing tools, and that's not unreasonable. But this doesn't explain why this particular form took root in certain regions and not in others, nor why it was not longer lived, if it was well suited to that purpose. They are far too clumpy to have worked as agricultural implements, either ardtips or mattocks. They could conceivably be used as weapons, but many are pretty unwieldy, and we would have to suppose their use either in highly codified combat or skullduggery. In exposing the weaknesses of these varied potential functions, I certainly do not wish to imply that these objects never saw use. My point is rather that their origin lay in some deeper symbolic role, and that any utilitarian function came as a peripheral benefit, perhaps determined by local needs. Some researchers have asked whether they might relate to the winning of metals, and they would certainly be capable of crushing newly won ore. In this context, it is noteworthy that two tight concentrations of axe hammers occur in immediate proximity to two known early Bronze Age mine sites, those at Alderley Edge in Cheshire and the Great Orme in Gwynedd. But their gross distribution is far too widespread for this to be more than a very local explanation. Axe hammers may not seem to us to be very obvious status symbols, but their grandeur may have compensated for lack of finesse when it came to showmanship. The evidence of distribution suggests that regional reactions to these impressive objects were extremely varied. We can look at their distribution in two ways, starting with their absolute occurrence, as in this slide, based on Rowe and Fenton's plots. What is immediately clear is that not only are there a number of very dense concentrations, each one I have defined here in the deep maroon includes at least 10 finds and sometimes tens of finds, but the wider distribution away from the dense zones also shows some intriguing patchiness. There is the suggestion of regionally differentiated acceptance of this type. This becomes clearer still when we turn to the other mode of presentation, where I've plotted the ratio of axe hammers to battle axes. Obviously all finds are considered here, not just those in funerary context. Some areas have a relatively even balance between the two types. This is the yellow zones. But others tend to veer strongly in favour of one or the other, red or blue. You can see that in some parts of the country there are patterns of alternation from one territory to the next, southern England and southwest Scotland in particular. I think some of these could relate to interterritorial distinctions, contrived to show opposition or difference. In this context, it is nice to see correlation sometimes with other contemporary data, quite unrelated data, I might add. For example, this little axe hammer zone down on the westernmost tip of Cornwall is precisely where one finds the entrance graves that have now finally been shown by Andy Jones and Charles Thomas to belong to the early Metal Age. Again, this linear zone of several battle axes in southwest Scotland occupies the higher ground on which stand the distinctive Bargrennan type tombs, recently revisited by Vicky Cummings and Chris Fowler. Indeed, their excavations uncovered two new battle axe graves. Now, was this a discrete territory, or a functionally differentiated part of the landscape tied socially and economically to the flanking lowlands? Throw that out for workers in southwest Scotland. The most striking feature of this plot, though, is that the sheer dominance of axe hammers in a broad swathe around the Irish Sea. We might regard this as an axe hammer domain during the early Bronze Age, and this must, I think, relate to very different values or customs. Let's be clear, even this proposed axe hammer domain did not totally reject battle axes, but they are in small proportion, a very small minority. It's interesting, for example, to see the funerary use of battle axes for the most part skirting around this zone, not only in the Bargrennan zone, but in the southern Pennines and Cheshire and possibly Wales. What more can we deduce about this important domain? I'm going to focus in today on the west of Pennine zone, which is also defined by the overwhelming use of grey wackie for both axe hammers and the small number of battle axes. This contrasts with other regions that adopted the axe hammer, especially the east of Pennine zone, which used quartz dolerite rocks. So there was regional definition in terms of production. The second important point is that the axe hammer domain is a region that lacked much by way of high-profile burial. There are a few such grave groups early on, that is in period 2, For example, the bronze dagger and flat axe from Manor Farm, Borwick, and the very recent find of an amber necklace in a burial at Miller. But after this, burials were not really furnished with goods that we might see as valuable or prestigious. The third point I would make about this region is that there really are not that many barrows and cairns relative to most other regions. There does not seem to have been any great preoccupation with creating the monumental landscapes of the dead encountered in other parts of the country. I don't see this as a sign of relative poverty or unduly low population levels, but instead as denoting a distinctive regional ritual system. From an early stage, these communities engaged in a different balance of ritual practices from most parts of Britain, and took on the axe hammer as a central component of ceremonial. From this position it could easily have come to symbolise that regional community's identity. Looking at this extraordinary focus on the Irish Sea coasts of Western Britain, you might naturally cast your eyes across the water and ask, is this part of an Irish Sea distribution? The answer is quite emphatically no. The situation in Ireland could not be more different. Perforated implements were not adopted with anything near the enthusiasm seen in Britain. Few burials contained battle axes, and the grand total of axe hammers was reported by Derek Simpson to be 17. The conceptual divide between axe hammers and battle axes does not mean there cannot be occasional elements of interaction, or that they are unrelated in origin. It is no coincidence that the generic form of most axe hammers is that of the earliest battle axes, and this probably means that the two British series originated at about the same time, from similar prototypes. The only plausible continental prototypes for early British battle axes, as pointed out long ago by Fiona, are the eminent and Ziedwälder types of the Lower Rhine and northwest Germany. We've got examples here in the left-hand column of the slide. I've already said a derivation recognised by Fiona many years ago. It is less clear whether there was any suitable prototype for British axe hammers, even though large perforated axe-like implements had existed for a long time on the continent. One interesting detail of correlations between battle axe types and their petrology allows a potential route of derivation to be suggested. We are focusing first on the lower half of this diagram in the grey box, and we see that battle axes made of rock types from the west, notably groups 13, 15, 23, in those zones which favoured axe hammers over the longer term, are almost all of early types, datable to period 2. It is therefore evident that initially battle axes were produced here as well as elsewhere, but I propose that communities quickly developed and then took to heart the enlarged version. Once this was established as a culturally meaningful artifact, regional production became devoted exclusively to it. Later battle axes, if required, were brought in from other source areas. On this model of development, British axe hammers were a creation of the Irish Sea coastlands, where they emerged during the course of period 2 and became omnipotent in relation to battle axes by period 3. The newly created type was sufficiently awe-inspiring to impress many other communities across Britain, some of whom produced it from local rock resources, though its uptake was, as we have seen, highly variable. In this lecture, I've continued the theme of competing ethoses started in Lecture 2. Battle axes like bronze and flint daggers were very predominantly accompany men in burials, and because the number known is relatively modest, it might be supposed that they too singled out men of some distinction, or men that needed some special emphasis in the funerary presentation. Although there seems to have been an initial stage of battle axes being used in combination with bronze daggers, this was short-lived, and they too were largely kept independent of the other key male status emblems. Much later, there was a limited return to dagger plus battle axe in a single grave, but I suspect this came about quite independently of the earlier association. Indeed, there is sufficient contextual independence between bronze dagger graves, flint dagger graves, battle axe graves, and possibly mace-head graves to suggest that these represent distinct ideas about how best to present the ideal male subject to this world and the other world. By implication, this suggests that those burying selected males with one or other signifier also held that object in especially high esteem in the living community, what we archaeologists refer to as the systemic sphere. But I do not think we should necessarily infer that only one type was being used by each community concerned. Co-use would help explain how in a minority of instances two of these signifiers were employed together in the same grave, normal funerary roles having been broken for whatever reason. Yet again, as we saw for flint daggers, there were at times deliberated choices being made during the early Metal Age to elevate certain lithic artefacts to a supreme social role. The power of my title is of course partly about the status implied by perforated stone implements, but it's just as much about the power of social choice to find new graphic material expressions for death personae. So far today I've concentrated on artefacts which essentially define or represent male authority. In my next lecture, I shall be correcting the gender imbalance by giving emphasis to ornament, suites, and the special presentation of women. Thank you.